In the spring of 1995, in a quiet town in Ohio, a woman went missing under mysterious circumstances, and authorities were left with nothing. But 15 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The heavy, suffocating weight of a toxic marriage is rarely visible to the outside world. It does not always leave deep physical bruises or shattered glass on the living room floor. Sometimes, the most dangerous prisons are built entirely out of quiet manipulation, extreme isolation, and absolute psychological control. For 10 long years, Diane Carter had lived completely trapped inside one of those invisible prisons. Diane was a highly intelligent, deeply compassionate 34-year-old woman with a warm laugh and kind brown eyes. But during her marriage to Eric Carter, that warm laugh had been systematically silenced. Eric was a man who demanded absolute perfection and total obedience. He monitored her phone calls, restricted her access to their finances, and slowly, methodically isolated her from her friends and her family. He convinced her that the outside world was entirely unsafe, and that she could only truly rely on him. But Diane possessed a quiet, unbreakable inner strength. After a decade of walking on eggshells in her own home, she finally found the incredible courage to pack a single suitcase and walk out the front door. The divorce was highly painful and deeply exhausting, but when the final legal papers were signed in the winter of 1994, Diane felt a massive, profound sense of relief. She had finally reclaimed her own life. She moved into a small, quiet apartment complex in Oak Creek, a peaceful suburban town in southern Ohio. She found a comfortable job managing a local community bakery, waking up before the sun rose every morning to bake fresh bread. The physical labor was tiring, but it was incredibly healing. For the first time in 10 years, she could choose her own schedule, spend her own money, and listen to her own music. Most importantly, the divorce allowed Diane to finally reconnect with the person she loved most in the world, her older brother, Cole. Cole was a tall, broad-shouldered man who worked as a high school science teacher in a city nearly 3 hours north of Oak Creek. He was a deeply protective, fiercely loyal brother. During the marriage, Eric had deliberately driven a wedge between them, making it nearly impossible for Cole to visit his sister. But now that Eric was completely out of the picture, Cole and Diane spoke on the telephone almost every single evening. As the spring of 1995 brought bright green leaves back to the Ohio trees, Diane made a massive, wonderful decision. She was going to completely leave Oak Creek behind and move 3 hours north, renting a small house just a few blocks away from Cole. She wanted to be close to her family again. She spent her evenings happily packing her belongings into heavy cardboard boxes, carefully wrapping her dishes in newspaper, and dreaming about the beautiful, independent future waiting for her. Everything seemed absolutely perfect. The dark storm clouds of her marriage were finally fading into the distance. But on a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 3 days before Cole was scheduled to drive down and help her load the moving truck, the telephone in Cole's kitchen suddenly rang. Cole picked up the heavy plastic receiver. It was Diane. Immediately, Cole knew that something was deeply wrong. Diane's voice was completely stripped of the bright, hopeful energy she had carried for months. She sounded incredibly tense, her breathing shallow and frantic. She was speaking in a quiet, trembling whisper, as if she were terrified that someone might be listening through the walls of her apartment. Cole asked her what was wrong. He offered to get into his truck and drive down that very night. Diane quickly told him no. She insisted she was physically safe inside her locked apartment, but she admitted that a deep, terrifying anxiety had completely taken over her mind. She told her brother that she had recently discovered something about Eric. She didn't say what it was, but she explicitly stated that it changed everything she thought she knew about her ex-husband. "I can't talk about it on the phone, Cole," Diane whispered, her voice cracking with heavy emotion. "It's too important, but I promise I will tell you absolutely everything when you get here on Sunday. Just please hurry." Cole agreed, telling her to keep her doors completely locked and to call the local police if she saw Eric's vehicle anywhere near her apartment complex. They hung up the phone, and Cole spent the next 2 days carrying a heavy, deeply sickening knot in the very bottom of his stomach. He knew his sister was not a paranoid woman. If she was terrified, there was an incredibly real reason for it. On Sunday morning, the sky over Ohio was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Cole woke up early, rented a large yellow moving box truck, and began the 3-hour drive south toward Oak Creek. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with 100 different terrifying theories about what Diane had discovered. He pulled the heavy moving truck into the paved parking lot of Diane's quiet apartment complex exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning. He parked the truck near the front office and walked quickly down the concrete sidewalk toward her ground floor unit. He knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. There was absolutely no answer. Cole knocked again, much louder this time, calling out his sister's name. The quiet morning air remained completely still. He pressed his ear against the cold wood of the door, listening for the sound of the television or footsteps inside. He heard absolutely nothing. A massive surge of pure adrenaline crashed over Cole. Diane was a highly responsible, deeply punctual woman. She knew he was driving 3 hours to help her move. She would absolutely never leave the apartment without telling him. Cole ran to the property manager's office. He explained the situation, his voice thick with rising panic, and practically begged the manager to use the master key to open Diane's door. Seeing the absolute terror in Cole's eyes, the manager quickly agreed. They walked back to the apartment. The manager slid the heavy brass key into the lock and pushed the door open. Cole rushed inside. "Diane!" he yelled, checking the small kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom. The apartment was completely empty. But the scene inside the rooms created a massive, incredibly confusing psychological contradiction. The apartment was absolutely pristine. There were no broken lamps, no overturned chairs, and no shattered glass. Half-packed cardboard boxes were sitting neatly stacked in the corner of the living room. A single coffee mug was resting gently in the kitchen sink, completely washed and clean. It did not look like a violent crime scene. It looked exactly like Diane had simply stepped out for a few minutes to grab a newspaper or check her mail. Cole walked back outside into the bright sunlight, completely terrified. He began frantically searching the sprawling apartment complex parking lot, desperately hoping to see her familiar face. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. As Cole walked down the long rows of parked cars, his eyes locked onto a familiar, dark blue sedan parked under a large oak tree near the back of the property. It was Diane's car. Cole ran toward the vehicle. He cupped his hands against the tinted driver's side window and peered through the glass into the dark interior. What he saw completely paralyzed his entire body. Resting perfectly neatly on the passenger seat was Diane's heavy leather purse. Cole immediately tried the door handle. It clicked heavily. The driver's side door was completely unlocked. He pulled the door open and grabbed the purse. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely pull the zipper back. He looked inside. Her leather wallet was still there. Her driver's license was still perfectly tucked into the plastic sleeve. Nearly $60 in cash remained untouched. It made absolutely no sense. A woman does not walk away from her vehicle, leave her door completely unlocked, and leave her purse sitting in plain sight. It was completely contrary to human instinct. But as Cole frantically checked the center console, the cup holders, and the floorboards, he realized something deeply, horrifyingly specific was missing. Her keys. The heavy metal ring holding her car keys, her apartment keys, and her bakery keys was completely, entirely gone. If Diane had been violently grabbed from the parking lot, her keys would have likely been dropped on the asphalt. If she had run away, she would have taken her purse. But the specific absence of her keys, combined with the abandoned purse, painted a deeply terrifying picture. Someone had not just taken Diane. They had deliberately taken her keys to ensure they had full, absolute access to her entire life, while leaving the purse behind to make it look like she had simply wandered off. Cole slowly backed away from the blue sedan, his breathing heavy and frantic. He looked at the quiet, peaceful apartment building surrounding him, suddenly realizing that the absolute worst nightmare of his sister's life had just silently, violently come true. Diane Carter was gone, and whatever terrifying secret she had planned to tell him had been permanently silenced before she ever had the chance to speak. Cole did not hesitate for a single second. He sprinted away from Diane's unlocked blue sedan, ran directly into the property manager's office, and grabbed the heavy desk telephone to call 911. His voice shook violently as he explained that his sister was missing, her car was unlocked, and her keys were gone. Within 15 minutes, the quiet, peaceful parking lot of the Oak Creek apartment complex was swarming with local police officers. Yellow crime scene tape was quickly pulled tightly around Diane's vehicle, and a team of uniformed officers began knocking on every single door in the building. The lead investigator assigned to the sudden disappearance was Detective Nolan Reed. Reed was a sharp, deeply methodical man in his late 40s who had worked missing persons cases in southern Ohio for over a decade. When he arrived on the scene, he immediately sensed the heavy, suffocating wrongness of the situation. Reed carefully walked through Diane's apartment. He noted the half-packed cardboard boxes, the clean coffee mug in the sink, and the absolute lack of any physical struggle. He stepped back out into the bright spring sunlight and looked at the abandoned car. Cole sat in the back of an open ambulance, gripping a shock blanket tightly around his shoulders. Detective Reed walked over and gently asked Cole to walk him through the last few days. Cole poured his entire heart out to the detective. He explained the toxic, deeply controlling 10-year marriage Diane had barely survived. He described how Eric Carter had systematically isolated her, monitored her finances, and controlled her every move. And most importantly, Cole told Reed about the terrifying, whispered phone call on Thursday evening. She said she discovered something about Eric, Cole explained, his voice tearing with raw, agonizing emotion. She was absolutely terrified. She was going to tell me everything today, but he got to her first. I know he did. Detective Reed immediately escalated the investigation. In domestic disappearance cases, the former spouse is always the primary focus, but Reed needed physical evidence to secure a search warrant for Eric Carter's property. He ordered a highly specialized forensic team to tear Diane's apartment completely apart, searching for any hidden diaries, letters, or clues that might explain what she had discovered. The technicians spent hours carefully pulling up carpets, checking behind air vents, and emptying the closets. Finally, late in the afternoon, a young forensic officer found something completely hidden in the bedroom. Taped securely to the bottom of the lowest wooden drawer in Diane's dresser was a thick manila envelope. Detective Reed put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of official, heavily detailed legal paperwork. It was an application for a severe, emergency protective restraining order against Eric Carter. Diane had quietly visited the county courthouse just days before she vanished. She had filled out the forms but had not yet officially filed them, likely waiting until she was safely moved out of town to trigger the legal action. In the handwritten statement attached to the forms, Diane had documented a terrifying incident. She wrote that Eric had secretly followed her to her bakery job, cornered her in the dark alley behind the building, and quietly whispered that if she ever tried to leave the county, he would completely destroy her life. The hidden paperwork was a massive, undeniable breakthrough. It proved that Diane was in severe, immediate fear for her physical safety, and it completely shattered any theory that she had simply run away. Reed immediately turned the entire weight of the police department directly onto Eric Carter. Detectives began digging deeply into Eric's daily routine, his finances, and his employment history. They quickly uncovered a deeply disturbing, highly calculated behavioral pattern. Eric had recently worked as a successful manager at a large retail store on the other side of the county. But investigators discovered that just 6 weeks before Diane vanished, Eric had voluntarily taken a massive pay cut and accepted a demotion. He had changed jobs, taking a position as a regional supply delivery driver. When Reed looked at a map of Eric's new daily delivery route, a massive, sickening chill ran directly down his spine. The specific roads Eric had requested to drive took him directly past Diane's apartment complex and her community bakery every single morning and every single afternoon. Eric had not just changed jobs. He had intentionally orchestrated his entire professional life to ensure he could legally, continuously stalk his ex-wife without drawing suspicion. Armed with the stalking evidence and the unfiled restraining order, Detective Reed sent 2 marked police cruisers to Eric Carter's pristine, beautifully manicured suburban home. They did not give him a chance to run. They placed him in the back of a cruiser and brought him directly to the precinct for an official, recorded interrogation. Cole paced furiously in the police station waiting room. Desperately hoping the detective would walk out and tell him they had a confession. But inside the windowless interrogation room, the investigation hit a massive, completely unyielding brick wall. Eric Carter did not look like a violent monster. He was a handsome, incredibly charismatic man wearing a crisp, ironed shirt. When Detective Reed presented the evidence of the new delivery route and Diane's deep fear, Eric did not get angry. He did not become defensive. Instead, he leaned back in his metal chair and put on a flawless, deeply terrifying performance. Eric looked directly into the detective's eyes, his expression completely filled with calm, genuine concern. He spoke in a smooth, perfectly measured voice. He admitted that the divorce had been difficult, but he completely denied ever threatening her. He claimed he took the delivery job simply because he was tired of retail management, and the route was purely a coincidence. "I still care about Diane," Eric said smoothly, shaking his head. "I want you to find her. I will do absolutely anything you need me to do." He completely consented to a full forensic search of his home and his silver sedan. He voluntarily submitted his fingerprints and DNA. And most devastatingly for the police, he provided an absolutely flawless, unbreakable alibi for the night Diane vanished. Eric claimed that on Thursday evening, he had hosted a private poker game at his house. He provided the names of 3 highly respected, wealthy men in the community who had been sitting at his dining room table until 2 o'clock in the morning. When detectives interviewed the 3 men separately, their stories matched perfectly. Eric had never left their sight. The police forensic team spent 2 grueling days tearing Eric's house and car apart. They used chemical sprays to search for hidden blood. They brought in tracking dogs. They checked the trunk of his silver sedan for fibers or hair. They found absolutely nothing. Eric Carter was a master manipulator. He had constructed a perfect, invisible shield around himself. Because he was so polite, cooperative, and legally protected by his alibi, the police were entirely forced to release him. He walked out of the police station with a calm, arrogant smile on his face, leaving Detective Reed completely paralyzed. Despite the devastating setback, the police continued to push the investigation forward. They began heavily canvassing the roads between Diane's apartment and her bakery, desperately searching for anyone who had seen her on Thursday evening. Just a few days later, a critical witness finally came forward. A young clerk working the evening shift at a small, rural gas station located just 2 miles from Diane's apartment called the tip line. He told detectives that he perfectly remembered seeing Diane on Thursday night, just after the sun had gone down. The clerk explained that Diane had pulled her blue sedan up to the fuel pumps. She looked incredibly pale, deeply nervous, and was constantly, frantically checking her rearview mirror. But it was what the clerk saw parked across the street that completely changed the trajectory of the investigation. Idling quietly in the shadows of a closed grocery store parking lot across the street was a dark, heavily rusted pickup truck. The clerk noticed the truck because its headlights were completely turned off, but the engine was loudly running. As soon as Diane finished pumping her gas and pulled out onto the main road heading toward her apartment, the dark pickup truck aggressively pulled out of the shadows and followed closely behind her. Detective Reed felt a massive surge of adrenaline. This was the exact missing piece. If Eric had been sitting at a poker table with 3 witnesses, he could not have been driving the dark truck. Eric drove a clean, silver sedan. The terrifying reality snapped into focus. Eric had not acted alone. He had used a proxy. He had convinced someone else to follow her, someone who owned a dark pickup truck. The police immediately launched a massive search for the mysterious vehicle. They pulled vehicle registration records for the entire county, searching for older, dark-colored trucks. They interviewed Eric's coworkers, his family members, and his neighbors, trying to find any connection to the vehicle the clerk had described. But the description was simply too generic. There were thousands of dark, rusted trucks in rural Ohio. Without a license plate number or a description of the driver, the lead was entirely impossible to track down. The phantom driver remained completely hidden in the shadows. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. As the warm spring transitioned into a hot, humid summer, the massive momentum of the investigation slowly began to die. The local news station stopped running Diane's picture on the evening broadcasts. The bright yellow flyers Cole had taped to every single storefront in Oak Creek began to fade and peel in the harsh summer sun. The police had exhausted absolutely every single lead. They had dragged the local lakes, searched the deep woods, and analyzed months of phone records. But without a crime scene, without a body, and without any physical evidence tying Eric Carter to the dark truck, the legal system could not move forward. 6 months after Diane's blue sedan was found abandoned in the parking lot, Eric Carter made his final, most devastating move. Knowing the police were watching him, Eric quietly listed his beautiful, pristine suburban home for sale. Because the local real estate market was booming, the house sold in less than a week. Without telling anyone, Eric packed his belongings, completely emptied his bank accounts, and vanished from the county. He moved entirely out of state, completely severing his ties to Oak Creek and making any future investigation infinitely harder for Detective Reed. When Cole found out that Eric had left town, a crushing, heavy weight of absolute despair settled over his soul. He drove down to Oak Creek, sitting quietly in his parked truck across from the empty apartment where his sister used to live. The case was officially going cold, and the man responsible was completely walking away into the sunset. But Cole Carter was a fiercely loyal brother. He made a quiet, unbreakable promise to the empty apartment. He would never, ever stop searching for her. He would spend the absolute rest of his life hunting the truth. A few days later, Cole met with the old property manager to finally clear the last of Diane's belongings out of a small basement storage locker. The manager was a kind, elderly man who felt terrible about the tragedy. As Cole was carrying a heavy cardboard box of winter clothes up the concrete stairs, the manager casually mentioned a small, seemingly insignificant detail that had been bothering him for months. The manager wiped his forehead and looked at Cole. "You know, the police asked me 100 times if anyone had broken the lock on her front door. I kept telling them no, but I forgot to tell them something else." Cole completely stopped walking. He turned around, his heart beginning to pound heavily against his ribs. "What did you forget?" The manager sighed, leaning against the brick wall. About 3 months before she disappeared, Diane's ex-husband came to the office. Eric. He was smiling, wearing his work uniform. He told me Diane was having trouble with a leaking pipe under her kitchen sink, and she had asked him to come fix it while she was at the bakery. A cold, sickening chill began to creep up Cole's spine. Eric said Diane had forgotten to leave the door unlocked, the manager continued, looking incredibly guilty. He asked if he could borrow the master spare key for just an hour. He seemed so nice, so helpful. I gave it to him. He brought it back later that afternoon and thanked me. Cole's hands began to shake violently, nearly dropping the heavy cardboard box. Eric hadn't just fixed a sink. He had taken the spare key to a local hardware store and completely copied it. The massive, terrifying mystery of the abandoned car and the unforced entry suddenly made perfect, horrific sense. The predator had absolutely never needed to break a window or pick a lock. He didn't need to grab her in the open parking lot where someone might hear her scream. He had possessed the key to her sanctuary the entire time. On that rainy Thursday night, while Diane was pulling out of the gas station, terrified of the dark truck following her, she believed that if she could just make it back to her apartment and lock her heavy wooden door, she would be completely safe. But she was never safe. The horrible, paralyzing truth washed over Cole. When Diane parked her car, left her purse on the seat and walked into her apartment, the monster was already inside, waiting quietly for her in the dark. The absolutely horrifying revelation that Eric Carter had secretly copied Diane's apartment key completely devastated Cole. He stood in the quiet parking lot, the bright spring sunlight completely failing to warm the freezing terror in his blood. Eric had never needed to abduct Diane from a public place. He had simply unlocked her heavy wooden door, stepped inside her safe sanctuary, and quietly waited in the shadows for her to come home. Cole immediately brought the property manager to Detective Nalen Reed. The manager gave a sworn, recorded statement regarding the borrowed master key. But when Detective Reed took the statement to the county prosecutor, begging for a massive, high-risk search warrant, the agonizing, rigid constraints of the legal system completely crushed their hopes. The prosecutor explained that borrowing a key 3 months prior was highly suspicious, but it was completely circumstantial. Without a witness, without a physical crime scene inside the apartment, and without a body, a judge would absolutely never authorize a raid on a man who had already moved out of the county. Eric's flawless alibi for Thursday night remained completely unbroken. The terrifying, invisible proxy driving the dark pickup truck had never been identified. The heavy, unyielding steel doors of justice completely slammed shut. The days slowly turned into weeks, the weeks faded into months, and the months ruthlessly marched into years. The massive, highly energized police investigation slowly lost its funding and its manpower. The heavy cardboard boxes containing Diane's case files were eventually moved into the dark, dusty archives of the police precinct. The case officially went entirely cold. But Cole Carter absolutely refused to let his sister fade into the dark. 15 long, agonizing years passed. The world completely changed, transitioning from the mid-1990s into the modern era of 2010. Cole was now 49 years old. His dark hair was heavily salted with gray, and his eyes carried the permanent, heavy exhaustion of a man who had spent a decade and a half walking through the world with a shattered heart. He had continued teaching high school science, but his entire life outside of the classroom was completely consumed by the search for Diane. Every single weekend, he drove across the state of Ohio, following up on completely dead rumors, begging retired detectives for help, and handing out updated, age-progressed missing person flyers. He was completely alone in his belief that she was still alive. Everyone else, including the police, assumed Eric Carter had quietly murdered her on that rainy Thursday night in 1995. But on a quiet, overcast Tuesday afternoon in the late autumn of 2010, a massive, completely unexpected miracle shattered the 15 years of agonizing silence. Cole was driving through a deeply rural, highly isolated county in southern Ohio, nearly 2 hours away from Oak Creek. He had spent the morning tracking down an old public records lead that had turned out to be completely false. Exhausted and deeply frustrated, he pulled his truck into the gravel parking lot of a small, heavily weathered roadside diner to grab a cup of coffee before the long drive home. The diner was almost completely empty. Cole sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, staring blankly out the rain-streaked window. Sitting in the booth directly behind Cole was an older man wearing a faded, heavy canvas work jacket. The man was holding a modern cellular phone tightly against his ear. He was speaking in a hushed, incredibly nervous whisper, completely unaware that Cole was sitting just inches away on the other side of the high wooden partition. Cole was not paying attention to the conversation until he heard a specific, highly familiar name cut directly through the quiet hum of the diner. "I don't care what Eric Carter told you," the older man whispered frantically into the phone. "The guy is dangerous. You shouldn't be doing work on that property." Cole completely froze. The heavy ceramic coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. The breath was instantly sucked out of his lungs. The man paused, listening to the person on the other end of the line before speaking again. His voice trembled with a deep, hidden fear. "I'm telling you, I saw the basement when I was out there fixing the breaker," the man whispered. "He still keeps that woman hidden out there. I know he does." Cole's entire world violently stopped spinning. The massive, suffocating grief of 15 years was instantly replaced by a blinding, explosive surge of pure adrenaline. He slammed his coffee mug down onto the table, slid aggressively out of his booth, and walked directly over to the older man. Cole reached out and grabbed the man's heavy canvas jacket, completely cornering him against the vinyl seat. The older man dropped his cellular phone in absolute terror. "Who are you talking about?" Cole demanded, his voice shaking with a fierce, unyielding intensity. "Where is Eric Carter?" The man was completely terrified. He tried to slide away, but Cole refused to let him go, desperately explaining that his sister had been missing for 15 years and that Eric was the man who took her. Seeing the absolute, raw devastation and desperate tears in Cole's eyes, the older man finally relented. His name was Arthur. He was a retired, independent electrician who took highly discreet, off-the-books jobs for cash in the rural county. Arthur explained that nearly 10 years ago, Eric Carter had hired him to completely rewire an old, deeply isolated farmhouse located at the end of a heavily overgrown dirt road deep in the Appalachian foothills. Arthur had been specifically instructed to run heavy-duty electrical lines down into the basement. "I went down there while he was upstairs," Arthur explained, his voice shaking violently. "It wasn't a normal basement. It had massive, heavy steel doors. There were thick deadbolts on the outside, and the small windows near the ceiling had been completely covered with thick metal grating. It looked exactly like a prison cell. Eric caught me looking at the locks and the look in his eyes. I packed my tools and left. I never went back. I was terrified of him." Cole did not wait a single second. He dragged the retired electrician directly to his truck and drove aggressively back to the local police precinct, demanding to see Detective Nolan Reed. Reed was now a deeply weathered, heavily grayed senior investigator. He was only months away from a quiet retirement. But when Cole burst into his office with the terrified electrician, and Reed heard the words Eric Carter and hidden farmhouse, the old detective completely threw his retirement paperwork into the trash. Reed immediately opened his computer and ran a massive, highly detailed search of the county property tax records for the specific rural road Arthur had described. The results explained exactly why the police had never found the property during the massive 1995 search. Eric Carter did not legally own the isolated farmhouse. The massive 50-acre property was officially registered to a completely anonymous shell corporation. But when Detective Reed aggressively dug through the heavy layers of corporate incorporation documents, he found a single, fatal mistake. The original founding signature on the corporation belonged to a man named Henry Carter, Eric's deeply estranged, deceased uncle. Eric had secretly purchased the massive, remote fortress using a dead man's name exactly 1 year before Diane vanished. He had been planning the absolute perfect, invisible prison long before she ever filed for divorce. Detective Reed immediately dispatched a team of highly trained, plainclothes detectives to the rural town located near the isolated dirt road. They needed to quietly build an undeniable mountain of physical evidence before they could secure a massive tactical raid. The detectives started by quietly interviewing the few neighbors who lived miles away on the main highway. The neighbors confirmed that the old farmhouse was officially supposed to be completely abandoned, but for 15 years, they had seen brief flashes of light cutting through the dense pine trees late at night. They had seen a silver sedan driving quickly down the dirt road in the early hours of the morning. The investigative team then moved to the small, independent general store in the rural town. They showed a photograph of Eric Carter to the store owner. The owner nodded immediately. He explained that Eric was a highly quiet, regular customer. He came into the store every single Sunday for over a decade. The detectives subpoenaed the store's archived paper receipts and made a massive, terrifying discovery. Eric was a single man living alone, but he consistently bought massive amounts of fresh groceries perfectly suited for 2 adults. The detectives expanded their search to the local pharmacy and department stores. They found heavily documented credit card receipts proving that, for 15 years, Eric Carter had been purchasing women's clothing, specifically heavy winter sweaters and comfortable pants, all in exactly Diane's unique size. But the most deeply disturbing evidence came from a local medical supply store. The archived receipts showed that Eric regularly purchased heavy-duty medical bandages, strong antiseptic creams, and large bottles of specialized liquid vitamins. The massive volume of medical supplies heavily suggested that whoever was living inside the isolated farmhouse was not permitted to see a real doctor, and they were in desperate, continuous need of physical care. The final, absolute breaking point of the investigation came from a retired county utility worker. Detectives tracked down the man who used to read the water meters for the rural county nearly 8 years ago. When they asked him about the isolated farmhouse, the old man completely broke down into heavy, agonizing tears. He confessed a deeply horrifying secret that had tortured his conscience for years. He told the detectives that one afternoon, while checking the heavy metal meter on the side of the old farmhouse, he had clearly heard a sound coming from a small, barred basement vent. It was the sound of a woman weeping. It was a raw, deeply agonizing, continuous sobbing. Before the utility worker could investigate, Eric Carter had suddenly stepped out of the front door, holding a heavy wrench. Eric had looked the worker directly in the eyes with absolute, chilling malice, and coldly told him to get off the property and never return. The worker had been completely terrified for his own family, and he had cowardly chosen to stay silent. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Armed with the horrifying testimony, the medical receipts, and the property records, Detective Reed drove directly to the home of a federal judge. He woke the judge up in the middle of the night, laying the massive mountain of evidence onto his kitchen table. The judge took one look at the utility worker's sworn statement and immediately signed a massive, high-risk, no-knock search and rescue warrant. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, a massive convoy of heavily armored police vehicles, federal tactical teams, and emergency medical ambulances drove entirely without their sirens through the dark, freezing Appalachian foothills. They turned onto the heavily overgrown dirt road, their bright headlights cutting through the thick morning fog. Cole sat in the passenger seat of Detective Reed's cruiser, his heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs. He gripped the door handle, praying silently that after 15 years of agonizing darkness, he was finally about to bring his sister home. The tactical team silently surrounded the rotting, two-story farmhouse. The property was completely surrounded by high, heavy chain-link fences. The windows were entirely covered by thick wooden boards. It looked exactly like a massive, impenetrable fortress. The SWAT commander gave the signal. A heavy, steel battering ram violently smashed into the solid oak front door, completely tearing it off its heavy iron hinges. Heavily armed officers flooded into the dark house, sweeping the rooms with bright white tactical flashlights, loudly screaming for everyone to get on the ground. They cleared the living room. They cleared the kitchen. They aggressively kicked open the upstairs bedroom doors. The house was completely, entirely silent. Detective Reed and Cole rushed through the shattered front door. The tactical team leader ran back down the stairs, shaking his head. The upper floors were completely empty. Reed immediately pointed toward a heavy steel door located in the back hallway, exactly where the electrician had described the basement entrance. The tactical team used a heavy industrial buzzsaw to violently cut through the 3 massive steel deadbolts securing the outside of the door. The heavy metal locks crashed loudly onto the wooden floor. They pulled the heavy steel door open and rushed down the wooden stairs into the darkness. Reed and Cole followed closely behind, their flashlights cutting through the damp, freezing air of the basement. The massive underground room had been completely converted into a crude, horrifying living space. There was a small, rusted bed frame in the corner, a chemical toilet, and a small wooden table. The small windows near the ceiling were entirely blocked by heavy steel grating. But as Cole looked around the room, a massive, crushing wave of absolute despair violently crashed over him. The basement was entirely empty. But the room did not look abandoned. It looked highly chaotic. A small television sitting on a wooden crate was still plugged into the wall, and the plastic casing felt warm to the touch. A half-eaten bowl of soup was sitting on the wooden table. Eric Carter had not abandoned the property years ago. He had been living here. Diane had been living here. But someone had tipped him off. Eric had somehow realized the police were finally closing in, and he had completely emptied the basement and fled the property just a few days, or possibly even hours, before the massive tactical team arrived. Cole collapsed onto the small, rusted bed frame, burying his face in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the agonizing realization that they had missed her by mere hours. But Detective Reed did not stop searching. He knew that if someone had lived in this concrete cell for 15 years, they would have absolutely left a hidden piece of themselves behind. Reed walked slowly across the cold concrete floor, shining his flashlight along the edges of the walls. He noticed that near the small, rusted bed, a section of the heavy wooden floorboards had been slightly disturbed. The nails holding the wood down had been carefully removed and replaced multiple times. Reed knelt down, pulled a heavy crowbar from his belt, and violently wedged it under the edge of the wood. He pried the heavy wooden board completely upward, exposing the dark, damp earth beneath the foundation. Hidden perfectly in the dark gap between the concrete and the dirt, completely wrapped in heavy plastic bags to protect them from the moisture, was a massive, thick stack of small, spiral-bound notebooks. Reed carefully pulled the plastic bags out of the hole and opened them. Cole rushed over, looking over the detective's shoulder. They were journals, dozens of them. Every single page was completely filled with tiny, incredibly dense, highly erratic handwriting. Cole let out a loud, breathless gasp. The tears instantly flooded his eyes. He recognized the beautiful, familiar loops of the letters immediately. It was Diane's handwriting. Detective Reed opened the very last notebook in the stack. He flipped to the most recent entry, shining his bright flashlight directly onto the faded ink. The date written at the top of the page was only 3 weeks old. The incredible, terrifying reality completely filled the damp basement. Diane Carter had not been murdered in 1995. She had survived 15 years of absolute, unimaginable captivity in the dark. She was still out there, entirely alive, and the massive stack of hidden journals was the absolute key to finally hunting the monster down. The massive, undeniable discovery of the hidden journals completely shifted the entire reality of the 15-year-old cold case. Detective Nolan Reed and Cole stood in the damp, freezing basement of the abandoned farmhouse, shining their heavy tactical flashlights over the massive stack of small, spiral-bound notebooks. Diane Carter had not simply vanished from the earth. She had been living in the dark, desperately holding onto her own mind, documenting every single agonizing day of her captivity. Detective Reed carefully placed the fragile notebooks into clear plastic evidence bags and rushed them directly back to the precinct. Sitting in the quiet, secure conference room, Reed and Cole began to read the journals. The words written on the faded pages completely shattered Cole's heart. Diane had documented the absolute, terrifying psychological control Eric had used to keep her completely isolated. Eric had not kept her compliant with heavy chains or violent physical beatings. He had used a weapon far more effective and deeply cruel. He had completely dismantled her reality. He had brought her heavily forged, fake newspaper clippings claiming that the police had officially stopped looking for her after just a few months. He had lied to her for years, telling her that Cole had completely moved on, gotten married, and forgotten all about her. But the most paralyzing manipulation was the threat to her brother. Eric had convinced Diane that if she ever tried to escape, if she ever screamed for help or broke a window, he would not hurt her. He promised her that he would drive directly to Cole's house and completely destroy him. Diane had stayed quietly in the dark basement, sacrificing 15 years of her own freedom, entirely to protect the brother she loved. But as Detective Reed analyzed the dense, erratic handwriting, he uncovered a massive, critical pattern in Eric's methodology. The journals revealed that Diane had not spent the entire 15 years in the basement of the farmhouse. Eric was a deeply paranoid, highly organized predator. Whenever he felt the absolute slightest hint of suspicion, if a utility worker looked at him strangely, or if a neighbor drove too slowly past the property, he would immediately panic. He would force Diane into the trunk of his silver sedan in the middle of the night and move her to completely different, highly isolated locations across the state. He had an entire, terrifying network of hidden prisons. Reed immediately realized that to find Diane, they had to uncover the rest of Eric's massive, invisible real estate network. But Eric was a man who lived entirely off the grid, using fake names and shell corporations. The investigative team aggressively pivoted to Eric's financial and digital footprint. They pulled 15 years of archived cellular phone records, subpoenaing the massive data logs from the local telecommunications companies. They were looking for any repeating, highly specific phone numbers Eric had contacted whenever he felt paranoid. After 48 hours of grueling, exhausting digital analysis, a young forensic data technician found a massive, undeniable anomaly. There was a single, unregistered prepaid cellular number that Eric had called hundreds of times over the past decade. The calls were always incredibly short, usually lasting less than 30 seconds, and they always spiked in frequency just days before Diane's journals indicated they had been moved to a new location. The police successfully traced the prepaid number to a massive, sprawling rural property in the northern part of the state. The land belonged to a man named Marcus Vance. Detectives dug deeply into Marcus's background. They discovered he was not a hardened criminal. He was an older, highly reclusive man who owned several Deepwoods hunting cabins and had served in the military alongside Eric Carter decades ago. They were old, deeply trusted hunting friends. Detective Reed assembled a heavily armed team and drove aggressively toward Marcus's property. They completely surrounded his small, quiet home, forcing the confused, terrified older man out onto his front porch. Reed slammed a photograph of Eric Carter onto the wooden porch railing, aggressively demanding to know exactly where the hidden cabins were located. Marcus looked at the heavily armed police officers, completely bewildered. He explained that Eric was a good, deeply loyal friend who had been quietly renting his isolated hunting cabins for years. When Reed demanded to know why Eric needed so many isolated cabins, Marcus's answer completely revealed the absolute, horrifying depth of Eric's manipulative genius. Marcus explained that Eric had come to him years ago, weeping and deeply distressed. Eric had claimed that he was taking care of his profoundly mentally ill, highly unstable sister. He told Marcus that the state government was trying to violently force his sister into an abusive, terrifying psychiatric institution. Eric claimed he needed a quiet, absolute sanctuary in the deep woods to protect her from the authorities and give her a peaceful life. Marcus had completely believed the heartbreaking lie. He thought he was helping a deeply dedicated man save his sick family member from a broken system. He had willingly handed over the keys to his remote properties, never asking questions, and never going near the cabins when Eric was there. Detective Reed pulled a photograph of Diane from his heavy jacket pocket. He held it directly in front of Marcus's face. He explained that the woman was not Eric's sick sister. She was his ex-wife, and she had been brutally kidnapped, held hostage, and completely erased from the world for 15 years. The older man stared at the photograph of the beautiful, smiling woman. All the color instantly drained from his weathered face. His knees violently buckled, and he collapsed heavily against the wooden porch railing. The massive, sickening realization that he had been an unknowing accomplice to a 15-year nightmare completely shattered him. The tears openly flooded his eyes as he begged the police for forgiveness, swearing he had absolutely no idea. Marcus did not hesitate for a single second to help the investigation. He immediately provided the police with the exact GPS coordinates and hidden access roads to a deeply isolated logging cabin located nearly 50 miles away, hidden deep inside a massive state forest. The massive tactical operation immediately shifted into high gear. Dozens of blacked-out police cruisers, armored vehicles, and state troopers drove fiercely through the dark, winding mountain roads, speeding toward the logging cabin. Cole rode in the front seat of the command vehicle, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm. They had the location. They had the element of absolute surprise. This time, they were going to bring her home. The tactical team cut their headlights and approached the final mile of the dirt road in complete, heavy darkness. They moved silently through the dense pine trees, surrounding the small, wooden logging cabin. The windows were completely dark. There was absolutely no sound coming from the structure. The SWAT commander gave the silent hand signal. The heavily armed officers kicked the front door entirely off its hinges, flooding the small cabin with bright white tactical flashlights. "Police, get on the ground!" they screamed, their voices echoing loudly into the freezing night. But as the bright lights swept across the single, small room, the absolute worst nightmare of the investigation violently repeated itself. The cabin was completely empty. But this time the evidence was not days old. It was completely, terrifyingly fresh. Detective Reed walked into the small kitchen area. Sitting on the wooden counter was a ceramic coffee mug. Reed gently placed his hand against the side of the cup. The ceramic was still incredibly hot to the touch. A heavy, iron wood stove in the corner of the room was actively burning, the thick logs popping and hissing with bright orange flames. A damp towel was resting over the back of a wooden chair. Eric Carter and Diane had not left days ago. They had been standing inside this exact room less than 10 minutes before the police violently kicked the door open. The deep, heavy tire tracks in the mud outside the back door proved that Eric's silver sedan had aggressively sped away into the dark forest just moments before the tactical team arrived. Cole leaned against the wooden wall of the cabin, gasping for air, feeling a massive, crushing weight of absolute devastation. It was entirely impossible. The police had moved with absolute, flawless secrecy. No one knew they were coming to this specific cabin except Marcus, and Marcus had been sitting in the back of a police cruiser the entire time. How was Eric staying exactly one step ahead of a massive, highly secure federal operation? Detective Reed began frantically searching the small cabin, his brilliant mind aggressively tearing the impossible paradox apart. He walked over to a small, heavy wooden desk sitting in the darkest corner of the room. Sitting on top of the desk was a complex, highly advanced piece of electronic equipment. Reed shined his flashlight onto the digital display of the machine. The blood instantly ran completely cold in his veins. It was a high-frequency, long-range police radio scanner. But it was not a standard, cheap commercial model. It was a massive, expensive industrial machine, equipped with heavy descrambling hardware. The terrifying reality of the 15-year investigation finally snapped into perfect, horrifying clarity. Eric Carter was not just a paranoid man hiding in the woods. He was a highly intelligent, deeply methodical monster who had spent years continuously monitoring the encrypted and unencrypted radio traffic of the local county dispatch and the state police. He had been sitting in the dark logging cabin, listening to the very voices of the detectives hunting him. He had heard the radio chatter when the police raided the old farmhouse, and tonight he had heard the tactical teams coordinating their silent approach to the logging road. He knew exactly where the police were, exactly what they were doing, and exactly when they were coming. The police were fighting a completely invisible ghost who could literally hear their every single thought. Reed realized that a massive, aggressive pursuit through the dark, winding state forest would be an absolute disaster. The dense mountains were filled with hundreds of branching dirt roads and hidden logging trails. If they chased Eric into the dark, he could easily slip through the massive perimeter and vanish into a completely different state, taking Diane with him forever. They could not catch him by chasing him. They had to completely force him into making a massive, fatal mistake. Detective Reed stood in the center of the dark cabin, his eyes burning with a fierce, unstoppable determination. If Eric Carter was listening to their radios, Reed was going to use that exact terrifying advantage completely against him. Reed immediately ordered every single officer and tactical unit to turn their portable radios completely off. He forced the entire massive operation into absolute, strict radio silence. He pulled Cole and the SWAT commander into a small, secure huddle outside the cabin. Reed quickly outlined a brilliant, highly dangerous tactical plan based entirely on psychological warfare. They needed to execute a massive, deliberate, completely fake leak of information. Reed used his secure, encrypted cellular phone to call the main state police dispatch center, located miles away from the forest. He instructed the senior dispatcher to heavily orchestrate a completely staged radio broadcast on the primary, unencrypted county channel that Eric was actively monitoring. 20 minutes later, the silence of the dark forest was violently broken by the loud, echoing static of the police radio sitting on the wooden desk inside the empty cabin. The dispatcher's voice came over the speaker, sounding incredibly urgent and highly stressed. All units, we have a confirmed visual on the suspect vehicle. A silver sedan matching Eric Carter's description is currently traveling at high speeds northbound on State Highway 42. Suspect is heavily armed and attempting to cross the state line. All available units converge on the northbound highway immediately. Set up heavy spike strips and barricades at mile marker 80. The radio broadcast sounded completely, flawlessly real. Dozens of police officers aggressively responded on the radio channel, confirming they were breaking off their searches in the forest and racing at top speed toward the northern highway. But it was an absolute, completely fabricated lie. There was no silver sedan heading north. The police were not racing toward Highway 42. In reality, Detective Reed had secretly ordered the entire massive armada of police cruisers, heavily armored vehicles, and state troopers to completely black out their headlights and silently position themselves along the only two southern escape routes leading out of the dense state forest. They had created a massive, completely invisible steel wall in the dark. If Eric was listening to the scanner, he would hear that the entire police force was aggressively rushing north. His paranoid, highly calculating mind would immediately realize that the southern roads were completely wide open and entirely unguarded. The psychological pressure of hearing the police closing in would force him to abandon his careful, hidden tactics and make a desperate, high-speed run for the southern border. Cole sat in the passenger seat of Detective Reed's completely darkened cruiser. The vehicle was parked horizontally across a narrow, paved county road, hidden perfectly in the deep shadows of the towering pine trees. Two massive, armored SWAT trucks were parked silently behind them. The heavy, freezing rain began to fall again, violently drumming against the windshield of the cruiser. The tension inside the vehicle was completely, incredibly suffocating. Cole gripped the edge of his seat, his breathing shallow and frantic, staring out into the pitch-black darkness of the empty road. The entire massive police operation was completely silent. They were waiting for a ghost to finally step out of the shadows. 10 agonizing minutes passed, then 20. The heavy rain continued to fall, completely slicking the dark asphalt. And then, just as the crushing fear that the plan had failed began to settle over Cole, a sudden, blinding flash of light pierced the heavy darkness. Miles down the winding forest road, a pair of bright headlights violently crested the hill. The vehicle was driving incredibly fast, the engine loudly roaring through the quiet mountains. The driver was aggressively swerving around the sharp curves, tearing through the rain, completely believing that the police were 50 miles away in the opposite direction. As the speeding vehicle came closer, the bright headlights illuminating the heavy rain, Detective Reed stared through the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel with absolute, iron strength. It was a dark silver sedan. Eric Carter had taken the bait perfectly. The terrifying, invisible monster who had stolen 15 years of Diane's life was completely, blindly accelerating at top speed, driving his vehicle directly into the massive, inescapable jaws of the waiting police trap. The dark silver sedan tore down the wet asphalt, the engine loudly screaming through the freezing, heavy rain. Eric Carter was driving with reckless, desperate aggression, his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed entirely on the dark road ahead. He was completely convinced that he had successfully outsmarted the massive police operation. He believed the entire state police force was 50 miles away, aggressively chasing a phantom on the northern highway. He thought he had a completely clear, open path to vanish across the southern border and disappear forever. He had absolutely no idea that he was accelerating directly into a massive, impenetrable wall of steel. As the speeding silver sedan rounded the final sharp curve of the mountain road, Detective Diane Reed picked up his radio and gave the absolute final command. "Light him up." Instantly, the pitch-black darkness of the isolated forest road was violently, entirely obliterated. Dozens of massive, high-intensity police floodlights and flashing red and blue strobes flared to life simultaneously. The blinding wall of light completely illuminated the two heavy SWAT trucks parked horizontally across the asphalt, entirely blocking the only escape route. Eric Carter slammed both feet onto the heavy brake pedal. The tires locked, screaming violently against the wet pavement. The silver sedan aggressively fishtailed, skidding wildly out of control, sending a massive spray of muddy water into the air before slamming heavily into the thick steel bumper of the armored SWAT truck. Before Eric could even process the massive, terrifying trap he had just driven into, the car was completely surrounded. Dozens of heavily armed tactical officers swarmed the vehicle, their weapons drawn, loudly screaming for him to turn the engine off and show his hands. Eric tried to lock the doors, desperately throwing his car in reverse, but the engine only violently sputtered and died. A SWAT officer used a heavy steel baton to completely shatter the driver's side window. The glass exploded inward. The officers aggressively unlocked the door, reached inside, and violently dragged Eric Carter out of the driver's seat. They threw him onto the freezing, wet asphalt, pinning his arms behind his back, and secured his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The flawless, arrogant monster who had hidden in the bright sunlight for 15 years was finally, completely broken. But Cole Carter was not looking at the man struggling on the ground. Cole sprinted frantically past the armed officers, running directly toward the rear of the silver sedan. He aggressively pounded his fists against the heavy trunk, desperately screaming his sister's name into the freezing rain. Detective Reed ran up behind him, holding the keys he had just violently pulled from the sedan's ignition. Reed's hands were shaking as he slid the silver key into the trunk lock and turned it. The heavy trunk popped open. Cole and Detective Reed aimed their flashlights down into the dark, cramped space. Curled tightly into a small, terrified ball, completely shaking and shielding her eyes from the blinding police lights, was a woman. She was wearing a heavy, oversized gray sweater. She looked deeply pale, her hair heavily grayed, and her face weathered by 15 years of absolute, unimaginable stress. But as she slowly lowered her trembling hands, squinting against the harsh light, Cole recognized the beautiful, kind brown eyes immediately. "Diane," Cole whispered, his voice cracking into a raw, completely agonizing sob. The woman completely froze. She stared up at the tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the pouring rain. For 15 long years, she had been told that this man had completely forgotten her. She had been repeatedly, methodically convinced that he had moved on, started a new family, and entirely erased her from his memory. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the absolute, undeniable truth. She saw 15 years of profound, relentless grief, and an incredibly fierce, unconditional love that had absolutely never died. "Cole," Diane choked out, her voice fragile and trembling, as if she hadn't spoken above a whisper in decades. Cole reached down into the dark trunk. He gently wrapped his strong arms around her fragile shoulders, lifting her completely out of the cold metal space and pulling her securely against his chest. Diane buried her face into her brother's heavy winter jacket. The massive, invisible psychological walls that Eric had spent 15 years building completely, violently collapsed. The absolute terror was instantly washed away, replaced by a sudden, breathtaking realization that she was finally, truly safe. She gripped Cole's jacket with a desperate, fierce strength, weeping openly in the freezing rain. Cole held her tightly, resting his chin on the top of her head, the heavy tears pouring down his own face. "I've got you," Cole cried, his voice thick with overwhelming relief. "I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped." Diane wept harder, the agonizing, 15-year nightmare finally melting away in the warmth of her brother's unbreakable embrace. The following morning, Diane Carter was sitting safely inside a warm, highly secure hospital room, surrounded by female detectives and medical professionals who treated her with profound, absolute kindness. Now that she was finally completely free from Eric's control, Diane was incredibly brave. She sat down with Detective Reed, and provided a heavily detailed, deeply emotional recorded statement that laid bare the entire, horrifying reality of her captivity. She confirmed exactly what Cole had suspected on that rainy Thursday night in 1995. Diane explained that she had accidentally discovered an old, hidden bank statement belonging to Eric, proving he had secretly purchased the isolated farmhouse using a fake corporate name. She realized he had been planning something terrifying long before the divorce was final. When she returned to her apartment that evening, Eric was already waiting inside. He had used the copied key to silently enter her home. He violently ambushed her, threatening her with a weapon, and forced her into the back of his dark pickup truck, which was driven by a terrified, deeply manipulated relative of Eric, who had since passed away. But the most devastating part of her interview was the explanation of the psychological torture. Diane explained that Eric was a master manipulator. He kept her locked in the heavily reinforced basements, completely isolated from the outside world. He told her horrifying, fabricated stories. He convinced her that the police believed she had simply run away to avoid her debts, and that no one was looking for her. Most importantly, he held Cole's life completely over her head. Eric swore that if she ever tried to escape, he would easily track Cole down and completely destroy him. "I stayed in the dark because I wanted you to live," Diane whispered to Cole, holding his hand tightly in the hospital room. "I thought my silence was the only way to keep you safe." Cole wept, kissing her forehead, completely overwhelmed by the incredible, selfless heroism of his sister. She had sacrificed her entire existence entirely out of love. The full weight of the American justice system rapidly and aggressively came crashing down on Eric Carter. The massive trial completely captivated the state of Ohio. Eric's high-priced defense attorneys desperately tried to argue that Diane had simply run away with him voluntarily, but their arguments were completely obliterated by the overwhelming, completely undeniable mountain of physical and digital evidence. The prosecutors brought Arthur, the retired electrician, to the witness stand. Arthur bravely pointed directly at Eric Carter, explaining exactly how he had accidentally discovered the terrifying, steel-reinforced basement prison at the old farmhouse. The prosecutors presented the massive stack of Diane's hidden journals, reading her heartbreaking, terrified daily entries aloud to the jury. They displayed the 15 years of secret cellular phone records, the grocery store receipts, and the utility worker's sworn statement about hearing a woman crying in the dark. And finally, Diane Carter bravely took the stand. She did not look at the floor. She looked her abuser directly in the eyes, her voice completely steady and strong, and flawlessly recounted the 15 years of absolute psychological and physical captivity she had endured. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Eric Carter was convicted on multiple massive federal and state charges, including aggravated kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and severe psychological abuse. The judge looked down at Eric with absolute disgust, completely ignoring his empty pleas for mercy. Eric was handed a massive, consecutive life sentence without the absolute possibility of parole, completely ensuring that the monster who had spent his life locking an innocent woman in the dark would die entirely alone in a small, concrete cell. Healing from 15 years of profound, extensive trauma is an incredibly long, difficult journey. It requires massive patience, deep psychological therapy, and an absolute commitment to trust. But Diane Carter was an incredibly resilient, deeply strong woman. She moved into a beautiful, quiet home located just 2 streets away from her brother Cole. She slowly learned how to navigate the massive changes the modern world had undergone while she was locked away. She learned how to use a cellular phone. She reconnected with old friends, and she slowly rebuilt her absolute sense of safety. A year after her miraculous rescue, on a crisp, beautiful spring afternoon, Diane and Cole were sitting together on her back porch, drinking coffee and watching the bright green leaves blowing gently in the wind. Diane smiled, looking completely at peace. She was no longer jumping at sudden noises, and she no longer feared the dark. The invisible walls of her prison had completely crumbled into dust. The story of the divorced woman who vanished into thin air stands as a chilling, deeply terrifying reminder of how easily a toxic, controlling relationship can escalate into an absolute nightmare. It proves that the most dangerous monsters do not always use physical violence. Sometimes they use fear, isolation, and stolen keys to build completely invisible prisons. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, incredibly beautiful testament to the indestructible power of a brother's unconditional love and the absolute, enduring nature of hope. A predator can copy a key, he can silence a woman in a dark basement, and he can completely isolate a person from the entire world for 15 long, agonizing years. He can believe he has flawlessly committed the perfect crime. But truth is a remarkably patient, entirely unyielding force. It waits quietly in the shadows. It survives in the dense handwriting of a hidden journal. It endures in the unshakable loyalty of a brother who completely refuses to stop searching. And sometimes, it finally finds its way into the light through a single, terrified, overheard phone call in a quiet roadside diner. Fear can hold a person captive for a decade and a half, but absolute truth and radical, unconditional love will always, eventually, completely destroy the darkness and guide the lost ones back home.